thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, all of you, for having me here today. This is a great opportunity. Is anybody getting hungry yet? You do mean hungry for data, don't you? Hungry for data? That's what I thought I heard. Okay, great. Well, as you just heard, I do work for the Wilder Foundation, and I just wanted, on behalf of the Wilder Foundation, to thank you, Mr. Hightower, and the rest of the community action folks leading this effort. As many of you know, the Wilder Foundation, it's right in the will that we've been here for over 100 years now, helping to serve the poor, sick, and needy in St. Paul, so we very much want to partner and help out with this effort to the extent that we can. I work in the research division of the Wilder Foundation, and for the past several years have spent a lot of time on this project called Minnesota Compass. So I just wanted to quickly, before we get into the data, to thank all the folks who do support the Minnesota Compass project. This information is brought to you in part by these funders, and not only the funders, but the advisors. We've had more than 500 people helping us out and advising us on the project. And so thanks to them, and maybe some of you have been among our advisory groups, so thank you very much. I'm going to have a pretty high rate. Your graph per hour rate is going to be maybe higher than you've experienced in your lifetime over the next, I don't know, half an hour or so before we do get to lunch. And I'm just putting this slide up to let you know that Minnesota Compass is a website. You don't have to feel like you need to memorize all the data that I'm going to talk about. You can go and reference it later. But what I'm going to do is give you a lot of information and help paint a picture and help understand what poverty looks like from a little bit different angle than we've already heard of today. We've heard a lot of compelling personal stories, and that's great. So I'm going to round it out with a little bit more data, but don't feel like you need to get every last piece down. You can either find it on the website at Minnesota Compass or through the Opportunity St. Paul materials and follow-up that you'll see on their websites. So I'll give you a little roadmap. We're going to go through these 6 topics, and we're going to blast through them, and we're going to have some fun along the way because we'll have a little quiz embedded. So I'll ask you guys to work as a team at your table to answer some quiz questions along the way. You'll see like question number 1. You'll know it when you see it. But this is where we're going. And so even though I just told you that you don't need to remember every last piece of data that I'm going to be talking about, I thought it would be useful if we could leave this room having 3 pieces of data that everybody would remember, so that we could start having this conversation, not just in this room, but you could tell people, here are 3 facts, and these are facts that more and more people could be talking about to help raise awareness about poverty in St. Paul. So here they are, and we'll return to them. In St. Paul today, there's over 67,000 people living in poverty. That's 24% of the population and includes 25,000 children. These numbers might vary a little bit from what other materials you've seen, but the fact is the numbers are updated annually, and this is the most recent census data. So we'll return to this, but 67,000 people in poverty, 24% of the population, including 25,000 children. Let's make this a little bit more real. This isn't part of the formal quiz yet. This is just a warm-up. So right here next to the Xcel Energy Center, so to make 67,000, put that in perspective, about how many times, does anyone want to shout out a guess how many times that would fill up the Xcel Energy Center? A lot of good guesses, but the first one I heard was 4. That is right. It's actually almost, it's 3 3/4 times, but that would look sold out for your wild games or whatever. It's a lot of people. Actually, when I was thinking about this, anybody want to take a guess if we had the population that's in poverty? What would that rank as far as the largest, among the list of largest cities in Minnesota? Anybody want to take a guess at that one? Okay, well, I'm not quite sure if I heard a consensus out there, but it would be the eighth largest city in Minnesota. It would actually be slightly higher. That's a slightly bigger population than the city of St. Cloud, if you can believe it. So it's a lot of people living in poverty. And we'll just do one more of these just to make things real for kids. 25,000 children that we talked about. if we put that in terms of school buses, how many school buses would 25,000 kids fill up? Not quite that many. We're talking about jam-packed school buses, about 70 kids per school bus, 357 school buses. If you place those school buses end to end, that'd be almost 2.5 miles of jam-packed school buses. When you leave here, if you're heading west on 94, off of the John Ireland Boulevard, that would be a string of buses all the way from that exit, past the Dale Street exit, past the Lexington Street exit, almost to the Snelling exit of kids. So there's a lot of kids in poverty here in St. Paul. So what do we mean by poverty? We've been talking a lot about poverty, and of course, here's a highly technical definition that I think we've been talking about. Not enough. That's basically what we're talking about, and we want to open those opportunities for folks. But when I reference the numbers, there is a slightly more technical definition that I'm going to be talking about, and that's the definition that was developed during the whole war on poverty effort that's been already referenced today. In the mid-'60s, an economist named Molly Orshansky at the Social Security Administration was charged with coming up with a definition of poverty. And they based it around a study that was done in the mid-'50s that showed about a third of a family's household income is spent on food. So they took a basic subsistence level diet, multiplied it by 3, and that was basically the poverty level. And that's basically still how we measure it today. It's updated for inflation, of course. And it does vary by family size, but you can see it's a whole matrix that ranges from 11,000 at the top to family with 9 or more people to 45,000. So it does vary by household size. And actually the table is more complicated than this because it varies depending on how many kids are in the household and so on. This is just to give you some background before we get into the numbers, and I usually boil this down when I'm talking to people so that they can get their arms around that the official poverty definition basically says if one person is earning under $11,000, they're officially considered to be in poverty, or if a 4-person family has an annual income of $23,000 or less, that they're considered to be in poverty. So that's basically what we're talking about when we're talking about the official definitions of poverty. Of course, we don't only care just about people who meet those official federal definitions. On the one hand, it's important to realize that not everybody who's in poverty is earning right up at the top of that threshold. In fact, almost 30,000 people in St. Paul only make 50% of that threshold, so that's severe poverty. On the other end, about almost 124,000 people in St. Paul fall under this threshold of 200% of the poverty level. And many people say, well, the poverty level is so low that we need to support everybody at least up to the 200% threshold. Just to give you an idea on what proportion of the population that is. So we have almost 45%, that's approaching half of the population in St. Paul that could be considered low income and in need of some assistance, or this whole opportunity St. Paul effort is definitely relevant to those folks. So we're going to look at some trends, so I don't want to forget the point that I thought maybe the mayor would still be here, and St. Paul is a beautiful city, right? There are a lot of opportunities in St. Paul. Unfortunately, however, the trends in poverty recently have not been quite so beautiful. On the national level, there's been a big increase in poverty, up to 15% that we've already mentioned. And so that's a big jump, and that's part of the recession that's still with us. Minnesota, fortunately, has lower poverty rates than the nation as a whole, but still has seen a fairly big increase here at the end of the last decade. But unfortunately, St. Paul's poverty rate is higher than both Minnesota and the United States. And not only that, but the poverty rate has increased at a steeper rate. So now that 24% that we're all going to remember that's where St. Paul is at, and you can see that that line has jumped up even faster in St. Paul than elsewhere in the nation. So let's review before we go on to the next section of how many people live in poverty in St. Paul? Great. And that is how much of the population? 24%. And includes, oops, I hit the button, 25,000 children. Thanks. So that brought us through a basic background. Now let's talk about the relationship between the age of the population and poverty. We've already been talking about that a little bit today, but this is your first quiz question. So see if you can come to some consensus. I'll make this quick because we want to keep things stepping along. But what are the poverty rates here in St. Paul highest among kids, working age adults, or older adults? See if you can come to some consensus in 20 seconds at your table. You're going to keep score at your table of how many of these 6 questions you get right. Okay, so how many tables said A? How many tables said B? How many said C? Some tables haven't quite developed consensus. We got a few different answers. So A is the answer to this one, children. The poverty rates are highest among children as shown on this slide. It's not that there aren't other people living in poverty. That's definitely, there is poverty all along the age spectrum, but over a third of kids in St. Paul, 36%. That's that 25,000 kids in St. Paul living in poverty. The rate is lower for when you get to working age adults and lowest among older adults. And this does show in part that some federal policy does matter. The Social Security program, it's sort of estimated that if we didn't have Social Security, that the poverty rate among older adults might be 2 or 3 times as high as the rates that we see here. So policy can have a positive impact on this as well. Still, I mean, those rates are still too high among older adults, but at least there is somewhat of a policy answer there. I won't go into this too deeply, but I like to pretend like I'm a demographer, and demographers love these things called population pyramids. And these 2 cities that I have side by side are really not cities at all. The one on the right is the population that's in poverty in St. Paul, and on the left is the population not in poverty. And basically you can see that these 2 graphs look pretty different. For example, if you look down at the bottom, in poverty and under 15, we have over 30% of that population group is under 15, whereas less than 20% of those not in poverty. I guess the main takeaway here is just shown that the population in poverty is younger than the population that is not in poverty. And so if you have, just in general, if you have 2 populations, 2 cities, and one of them, all else being equal, if one of them is younger than the other, there'll likely be higher poverty in the place with the younger age demographic. But still, here in St. Paul, there's something different going on, because if you just look at the kids in St. Paul, like we've already talked about, the poverty rate is over a third, 36% of kids. Whereas in Minnesota as a whole, it's half that. It's still too high, but it's 15%. So we'll talk a little bit about, that means that the challenge is high for Opportunity St. Paul. And we'll talk a little bit about the roots, why this is as we make our way through the discussion here today. But this brings us to the quiz question number 2. It's a little bit longer. You're going to have to really work with your neighbors on this one. So in the schools, in the K through 12 system, students can qualify for free or reduced price lunch if their family income is up to 185% of the poverty level. So how many students attending the St. Paul Public Schools qualify? And I think if you were listening to Suzanne at the opening remarks, you have kind of a running start on this one. So that's a hint. So see if you can come to some consensus on this.